Experience and its representations. Traditional constructions of reality in Western thought through the 19th century. By Arnold Kalnitsky. The premise of this little work is simple. Reality as perceived is not simply the taken for granted given it may appear to be at any given time or place in human history. No matter how seemingly self-evident and apparently beyond even the most cursory stage of reflection, the reality of our own subjectivity and our perceptions of the objective world are yet particular constructs. Shaped, articulated, defined, valued, categorized through a variety of filters. Primarily, the historical, sociological, cultural, psychological dynamics of human civilization shape and determine how reality will be represented and expressed at any time and place. Human experience as such will be culturally configured and ordered, although the full potencies and possibilities inherent in the human organism may be perceived and esteemed differently within specific social contexts. Our focus is primarily on the Western cultural and intellectual representations of reality. The very readily identifiable and historically distinct notion of Western civilization presupposes an underlying orientation and ordering of how the collective image of reality is perceived, lived in, transmitted, shaped, honed, refined. And conceptually, two dominant ideational strands have historically been the major channels by which reality has been represented. These we may term, for the sake of simplicity, the traditions of faith and reason. The nexus of ideas and feelings about the nature of reality represented in the tradition of faith have been mostly embodied in the doctrines and systems of religion. The contents of the tradition of reason have been embodied in the cultural forms of philosophy and science. We shall try and follow these three cultural institutions historically, though in relatively brief and general terms. Simply presenting the essential outlines of the evolution of ideas as they pertain to how reality has been understood and evaluated. As well, however, we will try to show that by the end of the 19th century the roots of a radical revisioning were on the horizon. In the process of adaptation and revision, these systems had to face a variety of new challenges to underlying assumptions. And in the process, have allowed space for other less dominant visions of reality to attain a degree of credibility and stature. We have termed one of those emergent alternative orientations to reality an inner-directed tradition. Though composed of a number of distinct and not always necessarily compatible sets of ideas, points of view, values, ways of treating experience, they yet collectively express a roughly consistent way of perceiving reality. The elements of this alternative orientation come from a variety of emerging sources. Focus on this inner-directed orientation will be dealt with separately. And one stream has already been discussed elsewhere. https://uir.unisa.ac/handle/10500/2108. We have not ventured into comparative judgment, nor disputes about ontological premises. And the ideas and themes singled out are not the only strands of the rich tapestry of these three traditions. But the paths we have discerned can be recognized as such, and do indeed collectively illustrate the unique Western tradition of how reality was represented. Unlike the animals, man does not pass his life within the security of his instincts. He has the power to shape it for himself. Man not only has awareness, he can also appreciate that he has it. In a curious way, man can stand back from himself and inspect himself. Self-awareness is as fundamental to his makeup as it is not to the animals. Once he has taken this step, he ceases to be merely part of nature. He gains access to a new reality, the world of ideas. The data of immediate experience becomes more than impulse and sensation purely directed to species survival. Data is not just transmitted and responded to instinctively. Through self-consciousness and abstraction, an ideational form of signification and meaning emerges. Besides the pure practical survival imperatives and demands, and the use of abstraction to deal with those preeminent necessities, the symbolic capacity also imbues the data of experience with qualitative meaning. Lewis Mumford has this perspective. The undifferentiated material for symbols and fabrications rise out of man, not waiting for any external challenge, but prompted by his own maturation. And it is surely no accident that the least controllable part of this flow, but eventually the most significant, indeed the very source of significance, wells up from the unconscious. What was uniquely serviceable for man's development was his ability to formalize these spontaneous images and symbols. By transferring authority to a controlling intelligence, sensitized by feelings, enlarged by imagination, man sometimes endangered his survival, but he opened the possibility of further development. Besides tools and techniques for survival, the self-conscious symbolizing and abstractly equipped developing mind also explores new domains, having opened the possibility of further development. These pertain to concerns arising from self-consciousness itself, as reaction to the dualities of self and world, and to all varieties of intersubjective dualities, perceptions and mysteries felt, imagined, surmised, indeed the very source of significance. And, the least controllable part of this flow, which wells up from the unconscious, are the defining characteristics of the emergent abstracting mind. Valuation, choice and judgment become part of the essential fabric of the symbolically enabled species, functioning with a controlling intelligence, sensitized by feelings, enlarged by imagination. Susan K. Langer has this insight into the symbolization phenomenon. The symbol-making function is one of man's primary activities. It is the fundamental process of his mind and goes on all of the time. Symbolization is pre-rationative, but not pre-rational. It is the starting point of all intellection in the human sense. For the brain is not merely a great transmitter, a super switchboard. It is better likened to a great transformer. The current of experience that passes through it undergoes a change of character. Not through the agency of the sense by which the perception entered, but by virtue of a primary use which is made of it immediately. It is sucked into the stream of symbols which constitute a human mind. We can use the analogy of the current of experience being transformed by the human brain and undergoing a change of character, as it is sucked into the stream of symbols which constitute a human mind, to indicate the fundamental role of symbolization. The raw data of experience is given shape, form, structure, meaning is filtered and treated via mental process. This next statement illustrates the difference between the symbolically constructed and the immediate modes of experience. Immediate experience, such as perceptions of things, feelings, acts of will and so forth, is momentary, dominating consciousness at one moment, gone the next. The past and animal experience consists of traces left from previous conditions, which influences subsequent behavior. Only when symbolism arises does experience become an organized universe. Only then do past and future exist in their symbolic images, thereby becoming manageable. The past becomes part of the organized universe. The future can be anticipated by way of its symbolic stand-ins, and so can determine actual behavior. Thus symbolism makes for the consistency of the universe. The process of symbolization stabilizes and articulates the flow of immediate experience. It transforms the feelings, sensations, impressions, etc. of immediate experience and creates an ordered and collectively viable structured cosmos. The embodiment of signification, capacities for abstraction, perpetuation of knowledge and techniques, the communicative and defining powers of language, the ability to act according to the guidance of generalized concepts etc. reflect the quantum leap effected by symbolization. Experience becomes more than just immediate reaction and response. And over time, the accumulated symbolic representations of experience undergo synthesis and integration, with the specific collective repositories of such data becoming the substance of culture and tradition. Without the symbolic function, the distinctly human universe of meaning could no exist. John Dewey puts it this way. Apart from the existence of symbol meanings, the results of prior experience are retained only through strictly organic modifications. The existence of symbols makes possible deliberate recollection and expectation, and thereby the institution of new combinations of selected elements of experience having an intellectual dimension. We have so far touched mainly on the cognitive, communicative and conceptual side of symbolization. There is another dimension, that of the imagination. The dynamics of mental activity appear to often imply the necessary presence of, and interaction between two opposite poles of a function. For example, thinking and feeling, logic and intuition, reason and emotion. And loosely, we can say that the intellectual, or cognitive side of symbolization is joined with the imaginative, or image-imbued side to function together in creating symbolic representations of reality. If we look a little at the distinctive traits of each side of the equation, we may be able to get a fuller picture. For the cognitive side of the mental mix underlying the capacity for symbolization, we have this dictionary description of the term, intellection. Intellection. The conceptual and rational processes, or the higher thought processes generally, conception, comparison, abstraction, generalization, reasoning. And for the other half of the duality, imagination, we have this definition. Imagination. The constructive, though not necessarily creative, employment of past perceptual experience revived as images in a present experience at the ideational level, which is not in its totality a reproduction of past experience, but a new organization of material derived from past experience. Such construction is either creative or imitative. In these definitions we find activities of mind which take the raw data of experience and configure it in distinctive ways. And both intellection and imagination are equally significant processes in the activity of symbolization and subsequent creation of culture. The polar interconnectivity of these modes of knowing has been expressed from many different perspectives, varying in terminology and nuanced interpretation according to original premises. Croce, for example, had this position. Knowledge has two forms. It is either intuitive knowledge or logical knowledge, knowledge obtained through the imagination or knowledge formed through the intellect. While we have discussed the cognitive importance of the symbolization process, we should reiterate that the imaginative factor is equally significant. The raw data of experience is not only filtered by abstract functions and practical demands, but impinges on consciousness and the unconscious in the form of images and subjective constructs. The given raw data of experience may be distorted and restructured through imaginative filtering and extrapolation. And the raw data may be represented as imaginal, stored in memory, becoming the substance of further novel and creative processing, embedded with signification for both the individual and the social group. Where it serves as part of the materials of symbolically stored power and import, and may be applied as a component of a collective culture. Mircea Eliade presents this view on the importance of the symbolic function as a dimension of value, meaning, signification other than the prosaic and the practical. Symbolic thinking is consubstantial with human existence. The symbol reveals certain aspects of reality. The deepest aspects which defy any other means of knowledge. Images, symbols and myths are not irresponsible creations of the psyche. They respond to a need and fulfill a function, that of bringing to light the most hidden modalities of being. So the function of this imaginative side of the symbolic process pertains to feelings, thoughts and aspirations of an existential character. To the mysteries, ambiguities, intangibles embedded in individual, group and cosmic subsistence and the urge to find purpose and meaning therein. Self-consciousness and the creation of self-sufficient symbolic concepts and images prepares the ground for proliferation of the wider domain of culture. We will focus soon on that topic. In the meantime, we can summarize by stating that the functional use of the two poles of symbolic activity for our purposes may now be classified for the sake of convenience as the intellectual and the imaginative. These are equal components of the symbolization process. Complementary and necessary opposite sides of the same equation. Treating, filtering, shaping, embellishing, extrapolating, embedding and encoding layers of significance and value to the data of pure experience. Creating on the personal level the intelligible and effective substance of self-conscious subjectivity, as well as supplying materials for cultural embedding of collective values and shared perceptions. Turning now to the connection between symbolization and culture, we sum up the importance of symbolization with a quote from Ernst Cassirer. In the human world we find a new characteristic which appears to be the distinctive mark of human life. The functional circle of man is not only quantitatively enlarged, it has also undergone a qualitative change. Man has, as it were, discovered a new method of adapting himself to his environment. Besides the receptor and the effector system, which are to be found in all animal species, we find a third link which we may describe as the symbolic system. This new acquisition transforms the whole of human life. As compared to the other animals, man lives not only in a broader reality, he lives, so to speak, in a new dimension of reality. Symbolization, as a uniquely human mental activity, is responsible for this qualitative change, Cassirer mentions. This new dimension of reality appears as both a subjective way of treating experience and as a cultural representation of the distinctly human mode of adaptation. If we think of this new dimension of reality as a stimulus to novel modes of interpreting and representing experience, it must mean that man will see himself in terms of his own awareness of self-consciousness, self-sufficiency and complex relationship to his environment. The recognition of selfhood, at whatever level of sophistication, produces a multitude of symbolic images for cultural application. If we look at this quote from Max Scheler and equate his use of the term spiritual being with that of our self-conscious symbol-creating, separate individual self, the meaning applies. The essential characteristic of the spiritual being, regardless of its psychological makeup, is its existential liberation from the organic world, its freedom and detachability from the bondage and pressure of life, from its dependence upon all things that belong to life. The spiritual being, then, is no longer subject to its drives and on its environment. Such a being has a world. Moreover, such a being is capable of transforming the primary centers of resistance and reaction into objects. Such a being is capable of grasping the qualities of objects without the restrictions imposed upon this thing world by the system of vital drives and the mediating functions and organs of the sensory apparatus. We will stray too far afield if we pursue the path of a general commentary. What we want to do is look at how the distinction between human and non-human existence is pictured. The phrase, existential liberation from the organic world, can be interpreted in various ways. Here, we see it as roughly representative of the difference between pre-self-conscious non-symbolic modes of experience and the new dimension of reality, opened up through symbolic representation of experience. And freedom and detachability, no longer subject to its drives and on its environment, also indicates that experience now is something which can be articulated and contemplated in a different frame of reference. In a world without biological restrictions, but with a new set of symbolically expressed values. The world of the spiritual being retains the fundamental duality of separate self, not self, and the dualities of subjective function, thinking, feeling, intellect, imagination, and so on. These are basic givens of experience. So, there really is a fundamental sense of duality embedded in human experience. The private self and the outer world is the fundamental datum underlying all reflection. And within the realm of the subjective, experience is a mix of contrasts and polar tensions. However, As mentioned, the new dimension of reality, world of ideas, world of the spiritual being, and so on can be seen as collective representations of specific configurations of symbolically expressed value. We can generalize and use the term culture to indicate this collective repository of symbolically treated materials. These are the intellectual and imaginative forms which embody specific insights, reflections, intuitions, commentaries on the facts, events, perceptions, mysteries and enigmas of experience. Another similar perspective is expressed by Karl Jaspers in these words. By attaining to a knowledge of his being, man is able to transcend life as a datum. By means of his culture, he consummates the mental process into which the extant machinery for the provision of the elementary necessities of human life is converted in virtue of the idea that permeates it. The mind creates a language for itself in art, science and philosophy. Simple physical subsistence, or life as a datum, requires self-consciousness and the capacity to reflect to allow man the attaining to a knowledge of his being, and be able to transcend life. And, by means of his culture, human life is converted, from pure focus on provision of the elementary necessities of life, to one in which new qualitative values are embedded. The cultural domain is where the mind creates a language for itself, and uses the forms of art, science and philosophy, amongst others to express the idea that permeates it. Next we will look at cultural issues in more detail. As we have stated, culture is a collective repository of symbolically represented treatments of experience. The variety of cultural forms express particular qualitative reactions to, reflections on, interpretations of, man dealing with the data of experience. Both in terms of confrontation with the outer objective environment of differentiation, and the various dynamics of inner subjectivity. And the faculties of mind with all their intellectual and imaginative, conscious and non-conscious potencies, work to produce the actual objects of culture. Let's take a quote from Franz Boas, The Mind of Primitive Man, to start with. Culture may be defined as the totality of the mental and physical reactions and activities that characterize the behavior of the individuals composing a social group collectively and individually in relation to their natural environment, to other groups, to members of the group itself and of each individual to himself. It also includes the products of these activities and their role in the life of the groups. Its elements are not independent, they have a structure. As such, culture, as we have said, as the totality of the mental and physical reactions and activities, is a transformational activity. The input of experience is transmuted into objective products. These reactions are to the external world apart from the self, to the natural environment, to other groups, to members of the group itself. And as well, to subjective reflection and inquiry of each individual to himself. Some of the content of culture are enunciated by Tyler. That complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, laws, customs and other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. We see that culture includes a wide range of both practical, socially regulatory, imaginative, affective concerns. And Kroeber has this perspective. We can approximate what culture is by saying it is that which the human species has and other social species lack. This would include speech, knowledge, beliefs, customs, arts and technologies, ideals and rules. That, in short, is what we learn from other men, from our elders of the past, plus what we may add to it. This categorization also refers to the comprehensive range of practical, ideational, evaluative, regulatory components within the cultural mix. As well, another important issue is raised. That of transmission of culture. What we learn from other men, from our elders, requires continuity in both content and means of dissemination. The institutionalization of data and existence of integrated social mechanisms allows for such continuity. The specific discrete interpretations of experience which inform and shape the realities of particular groups will undergo modification over time, what we add to it, but often a fundamental orientation in basics will be maintained. If we want to get a more biologically grounded perspective, these words by Julian Huxley apply. Culture is a shared or shareable body of material, mental, and social constructions, artifacts, mentefacts and sociofacts created by human individuals living in a society, but with characteristics not simply explicable by or directly deducible from a knowledge of the psychological or physiological properties of human individuals. The body of material, mental and social constructions, are a collective repository of articulated human experience, represented through expression within the varied cultural forms. And as such, cannot be reduced to a simple causal process based only on utility or instinct. There is something more unique and enigmatic, with characteristics not simply explicable by or directly deducible from a knowledge of the psychological or physiological properties of human individuals. The distinctively human imbuing of value, meaning, significance above and beyond the needs for basic physical survival imprints the materials of culture with a separate quality. Huxley goes on further to describe the elements of culture. In describing and analyzing a culture, we need to distinguish a number of distinct components. First, the material or resource basis. Secondly, the basis of communication or language. Thirdly, skills and techniques including tools and machines, dress and adornment, buildings and vehicles, and works of art. Then systems of social organization, including kinship and marriage systems, legal, political and administrative systems, and status systems such as class and caste. Then knowledge systems, including education, science, and higher learning. And finally, attitude systems, ranging from manners to religion, and including personal and social ethics, taboos and rituals. Obviously, such a comprehensive anatomy of culture includes the full range of human reactions to outer and inner, objective and subjective, experience. From the purely practical and pragmatic to the most intangible. From the most basic to the most significant. The hierarchical approach Huxley describes begins with the most immediate in terms of ensuring physical survival, the material or resource basis. It then goes on to encompass the various spheres of social knowledge and organization. At the high end of the scale he posits attitude systems, where the most subjective and enigmatic dimensions of experience are dealt with. As a whole, the material, social, theoretical, ideal spheres are variously contained as parts of the cultural mix. Chapter 2. Our interest is not in examining each and every cultural component, but in trying to deal with some general underlying structural implications. Narrowing our focus, we may say that we are interested in the way culture represents reality, in terms of providing a ready-made configuration of how experience is treated, interpreted, evaluated. Thus we will be looking mainly at portions of the ideational systems most representative of the consensual ways of defining the nature of the real. This of course does not deny that each and every facet of culture has a bearing on how reality is presented. However, as a general rule, the theoretical overviews, valuations, treatments of experience with the most collective authority come from specific cultural institutions, which are explicitly the definitive sources for perpetuating and imprinting a specific sense of what reality is. The introduction of two terms will help in understanding how discrete cultural constructions of reality are perceived as self-evident reality. These terms are acculturation and internalization. The first term, acculturation, has a double application. On the macrocosmic level, it applies to contact and interaction between different cultures. At this stage, we will refrain from following the implications of that definition. We are more interested right now with the general relationship between the individual and the encompassing culture. This is the microcosmic definition of acculturation, a process of conditioning a child in the behavior patterns, overt or covert, of his in-groups. We can use this definition to extricate further meaning. If we equate the term in-group to that of a specific self-contained culture, we can think of it as an inclusive process of informational imprinting. Conditioning means a process of teaching and exposing the individual to the prevailing norms and the general framework of knowledge and values of the given culture. His in-group, in a wider sense. The conditioning may be more or less flexible, depending on both personal and social dynamics, but as the original informing process, leaves a particularly configured template by which the nature of reality is initially comprehended. In their book, The Social Construction of Reality, Berger and Luckman interpret culture as a formative factor in the process of acculturation using the phrase, society is subjective reality. Culture is first experienced as an apparent, given, a transpersonal autonomous and, self-evident, configuration presented as reality. And socialization is the ongoing dialectical process, by which the individual internalizes the socially embedded parameters while externalizing and imbuing that world of appearances with the sense of reality. In primary socialization there is no problem of identification. Society presents the candidate for socialization with a predefined set of significant others whom he must accept as such. His internalization of their particular reality is quasi-inevitable. He internalizes it as the world, the only existent and only conceivable world. It is for this reason that the world internalized in primary socialization is so much more firmly entrenched in consciousness than worlds internalized in secondary socializations. However much the original sense of inevitability may be weakened in subsequent disenchantments, the recollection of the certainty of the first dawn of reality still adheres to the first world of childhood. Primary socialization thus makes appear as necessity what in fact is a bundle of contingencies. The specific contents that are internalized in primary socialization vary, of course, from society to society. Finally, there is internalization of at least the rudiments of the legitimating apparatus. Acculturation and primary socialization effectively say the same thing. The candidate is born into a particular family and society at a given time and location and is imprinted with the basic rudiments for absorbing and adjusting to the prevailing representation of reality. There is no choice. The process is quasi-inevitable and creates the certainty of the first dawn of reality. So, what in fact is a bundle of contingencies, becomes originally internalized as the world, the only existent and only conceivable world. Although the specific contents which are internalized in primary socialization vary, of course, from society to society, they yet represent an envisioned reality, so much more firmly entrenched in consciousness than any possible worlds internalized in secondary socialization. Thus, even though a detached sense of relativity and objective analysis is possible at any time and place, the primary cultural environment will yet be a framework of representation maintained subconsciously or consciously. And that is reiterated with internalization of at least the rudiments of the legitimating apparatus. We will discuss the legitimating process shortly. Right now, let us go back to an earlier reference. We can recall that raw experience is reshaped by the symbolic, transformer, faculties of the human mind. That the human species is equipped with intellectual and imaginative capacity for creating the cultural categories by which a new dimension of reality is formed. The process of acculturation simply is a social phenomenon which extends and reiterates this entry into a distinctly human universe, the world of ideas. The only way to preserve continuity is to perpetuate the process of conditioning, the primary socialization, as an active component within the cultural matrix. Thus, as forces of legitimization, they need to retain connectivity to the informing sources of value and meaning. We shall look at these issues in more detail later, but here we indicate that through institutionalization, those ideals and ideas need continual reiteration and attention to counteract any potential dilemma of relevance and adequacy. If, over time, the data of experience does not seem to be adequately explained, represented, maintaining significance, then its hold will weaken. New perceptions, interpretations of experience, ways of symbolic articulation may be integrated into the old structure, thus keeping it vibrant. Or, they may be in conflict, provoking discord and requiring alternative reconstruction. Another important issue in the discussion of acculturation goes back to the very question of how experience is treated. First internally by the faculties of mind, then by the social frameworks of culture. We will go into greater detail later, but we should mention now that one of the lines of discussion will deal with various aspects of conscious and unconscious experience. At this point, we will simply say that one of the functions of acculturation is to provide interpretation, meaning, understanding to the contents of mental activity. We will discuss how the activities of mind may encompass a great range of experiential potencies. The terms, consciousness, and the unconscious, or subconscious, are the common forms of phrasing this duality of mental activity. We will discuss in detail speculation about potential further classifications of experience. Specifically, we will introduce the term supraconscious to account for particular modes of mental activity which can be deduced from particular types of experience. Right now we will move back to our original discussion, only emphasizing the fact that acculturation is one of the forces which shapes how internal subjective experience is treated and valued. The attitudes, traditions, beliefs, and other facets of cultures may tend to encourage or discourage, look for or ignore, value or fear, expression of particular types of subjective experience. And particular cultural institutions and channels have treated manifestation of, and attention to, such phenomena in a variety of ways as we shall see. Although acculturation is by definition a shaping and limiting process, it still is a necessary component of human social existence. The very structural foundation of society presupposes organizational boundaries and channels for directing consciousness. These words from Quant's Phenomenology of Social Existence indicate this importance. The newborn human being is indeed an immensity of virtuality. It is wholly unthinkable, however, that this man could begin afresh with the project of life and of the world, that he could execute the project by means of his own powers. The newborn man is the most helpless being on earth. Left to himself he cannot do anything and is doomed to die. Our life is unthinkable without an organized world. But it is impossible that the individual himself project the orderly world which he needs. The orderly world presents itself to the child and invites him, as it were, to enter. The orderly world is, so to speak, offered to man by the society in which he lives. Otherwise a genuinely human existence would be entirely impossible. This orderly world is the encompassing framework of cultural forms, the substance of which comprise the content of specific historical traditions. The immensity of virtuality refers to the full range of experiential potencies. When the acculturation process occurs on the microcosmic level, between newborn individual and society, the orderly world of a given cultural tradition presents itself to the child and invites him to adapt to a specific mode of envisioning the world. The filters and definitions, descriptions and valuations encoded at discrete times in history and places of geography become the way reality is initially perceived and related to. The variables of the cultural mix, the forms of the orderly world, are many, as has been indicated. From the ideational context, a few generally representative terms can be uncovered. Here is a useful quote from C. Wright Mills. Men lives in second-hand worlds. They are aware of much more than they have personally experienced, and their own experience is always indirect. The quality of their lives is determined by meanings they have received from others. Everyone lives in a world of such meanings. No man stands alone confronting a world of solid fact. No such world is available. Their experience itself is selected by stereotyped meanings and shaped by ready-made interpretations. Their image of the world and of themselves are given to them by crowds of witnesses they have never met and never shall meet. Yet for every man these images, provided by strangers and dead men, are the very basis of his life as a human being. Mills uses the term cultural apparatus to describe the collectivity of stereotyped meanings, which are applied to experience and which are shaped by ready-made interpretations. As a whole, the specifically conditioned and defined worldview which is the source of acculturation is called their image of the world and of themselves. And the strangers and dead men who have contributed to the particular social constructions of reality are the significant figures of the culture and tradition. As well as the term cultural apparatus, the phrases designs for living, from Kluckholm, and social stock of knowledge, from Berger and Luckman also amplify the same points. The other important process of cultural transmission and validation of specific worldviews is that of internalization. Acculturation shows one side, how the out there contents of particular cultures are already in place, ready to be applied whenever the newborn enters that particular society. However, the individual is more than just a passive recipient. There are degrees and variations of how the process is worked. We will use the term internalization to refer to the subjective, personal, active side of the process. We have earlier touched on the process of internalization as pertaining to primary socialization. Here we look at it separately. Berger and Luckman supply the following applicable definition. Internalization is the basis for the apprehension of the world as a meaningful and social reality. This apprehension does not result from autonomous creations of meaning by isolated individuals, but begins with the individual taking over the world in which others already live. To be sure, the taking over may be creatively modified or even recreated. So, internalization is a dialectical relationship between the individual and the world in which others already live, an ongoing continual process. And in the process, individuals may act upon, or take over, and creatively modify or recreate a portion of the cultural content which makes up the social reality. This phase of potential modification presupposes a later stage of development and sophistication of mind than found during the acculturation imprinting. Acculturation, or primary socialization, provides the basic mechanism for a specific construction of reality. It is that by which the child is given the parameters and guidelines for interpreting experience. However, at later stages of maturity and mental development, the possibility of confronting, reorganizing and revaluing the parameters and data of experience is a distinct possibility. Now that the concepts of potential, modification, and recreation have been introduced, we also must examine another key concept. Namely, that of legitimation, and with it, the function of legitimating authorities and institutions. Firstly, let us look again at a static cross-section of how socially constructed views of reality may simply appear to be the normal and natural way of interpreting experience. Cultures vary greatly in their degree of integration. Synthesis is achieved partly through the overt statement of the dominant conceptions, assumptions and aspirations of the group in its religious lore, secular thought, and ethical code, partly through habitual but unconscious ways of looking at the stream of events, ways of begging certain questions. To the naive participant in the culture, these modes of categorizing, of dissecting experience along these planes and not others, are as much givens as the regular sequence of daylight and darkness or the necessity of air, water and food for life. The habitual but unconscious ways of looking at the stream of events, is, as we have touched on, a matter of acculturation, internalization, the teaching and transmission of particular cultural paradigms. The quasi-automatic objectification of the world of appearances begins in early infancy and is reinforced and reiterated during a lifetime. Though, as we mentioned, modification and adaptation is an ongoing process, whether in minute incremental steps or in larger revisions. Under such circumstances, the sense of continuity and stability may simply appear normal and natural, or more discordant gaps in connectivity may arise. Above and inclusive of the microcosmic process of the larger one. That is the explication of the criteria and parameters defining the specifically envisioned representations of reality. This leads us to the concept of legitimation. We shall begin with this definition. Legitimation is a process as best described as a second-order objectification of meaning. Legitimation produces new meanings that serve to integrate the meaning already attached to disparate institutional processes. The function of legitimation is to make objectively available and subjectively plausible the first-order objectivations that have been institutionalized. It should be added that integration, in one form or another, is also the typical purpose motivating the legitimators. Legitimation explains the institutional order by ascribing cognitive validity to its objectivated meanings. Legitimation justifies the institutional order by giving a normative dignity to its practical imperatives. It is important to understand that legitimation has a cognitive as well as a normative element. In other words, legitimation is not just a matter of values. It also implies knowledge as well. The process of legitimation produces new meanings, which explicate and consolidate the original sets of premises and assumptions. As a second-order objectification of meaning, there is amplification and peripheral supplementation that serve to integrate the meaning already attached to disparate institutional processes. The first-order objectivations are already part of the foundation of ideas and meanings that have been institutionalized. Legitimation is intended to convey subjective assurance and confidence in those first-order objectivations. What may indeed lie implicit is to be made objectively available through secondary amplification and interpretation. And the objective of affecting subjectively plausible second orders of meaning is to maintain the semblance of seamless continuity. Thus, articulation and presentation has an explicit end. Integration, in one form or another, is also the typical purpose motivating the legitimators. Conveyance of assured confidence in the truth quotient is also a part of the function, which must include ascribing cognitive validity to its objectivated meanings. And maintenance of the integrity of the institution and what it represents includes being able to justify the institutional order by giving a normative dignity to its practical imperatives. Assuring that a foundation of common values supports whatever lines of action may be contemplated or undertaken keeps the institution stable and efficacious. So with both a cognitive as well as a normative element, legitimation must factor into both sides of the equation. It must convey plausibility as well as validity for effective institutional credibility. The legitimating process has to be both a matter of values, in addition to also inferring knowledge as well. Insofar as the process of legitimation itself is concerned, it must act through specific institutions to be effectively enabled. And that returns us to discussion of the institutions by which the ideas and values of culture are expressed and given meaning. These dominant conceptions, assumptions, aspirations, are expressed culturally through the forms of religious lore, secular thought and ethical code. Although other cultural avenues may also be explored, in terms of explicit representations of the nature of reality, we move more specifically to three historically authoritative cultural institutions. The three divisions stated above are conveniently significant for our upcoming analysis of the main historical authoritative legitimizing institutions of Western civilization. They very generally symbolize the three major ideational frameworks of Western thought, which we will examine in more detail. We can equate the above references as thus: religious lore equates to the institution of religion. Ethical code can roughly be equated with the domain of formal philosophy. Secular thought can be interpreted as representing the field of the empirical sciences. In a suggestive, elusive, if not exact, sense. However, before we can move to that phase of our analysis, some other conceptual issues need to be discussed. Right now, a little more focus on the concept of an authoritative legitimizing institution is necessary. We have just looked at the basic outline of the process of legitimation, where reference was regularly made to the term institution. Since a number of allusions and connotations are suggested by the term, we must clarify our own usage in order to more fully explain its precise meaning throughout this work. First, a reference to the sociological definition of institutions. In sociology, activities which are repeated or continuous within a regularized pattern that is normatively sanctioned. Sociologists usually speak of four major complexes of institutions: political institutions, economic institutions, cultural institutions deal with the religious, artistic, and expressive activities and traditions in the society. Kinship institutions are studied comparatively in order to see how different societies organize their political or religious life. Or a set of related institutions within a society may be studied as a social system in order to see how they affect each other. The activities which are repeated or continuous include the ongoing perpetuation of the most socially esteemed ideals, beliefs, ideas, and practices, represented and enabled, within a regularized pattern that is normatively sanctioned, or publicly valued and legitimated. The cultural institutions embodying those ideals, beliefs, ideas, and practices include those that deal with the religious, artistic, and expressive activities in the society. These, in the broadest sense, include all the channels by which reality is envisioned. If expressive is interpreted as including the various compendiums of knowledge within a culture, as well as comparison of different institutions, a set of related institutions within a society may be studied as a social system in order to see how they affect each other. Thus, where common themes, intentions, subject matter is discerned in different institutions, their interconnectedness may offer new suggestions. Where cultural institutions represent activities and traditions in the society, they internally are fluid, somewhat malleable to the effects of ongoing cultural change, falling anywhere on the scale between remaining vibrant and efficacious or stagnant and out of touch. Left says the following: the progression from ideal to institution is one of the most common forms of social evolution. An initially revolutionary belief becomes embodied in a way of life, which takes on an independent existence. Its maintenance becomes an end in itself. Institutions like individuals grow, but unlike individuals, their growth is not organic. There is no self-regulating mechanism within an institution which enables its past to be superseded like the replacement of cells in a body. Values remain, after the practices which they have inspired have changed. What may begin as an insight, a type of knowledge, nexus of values, mode of envisioning may go through a progression from ideal to institution, as it gains support and empathetic public resonance. At one extreme, the qualitative force of the initiating impetus may appear as a revolutionary belief, which, over time and familiarity, becomes embodied in a way of life, acquiring its own independent existence. Even when not directly connected to the sphere of action, simply as an embedded component in an ideational system, institutions shape and filter the way life is perceived and evaluated. As a now established part of the fabric of the known, its maintenance becomes an end in itself, in terms of perpetuation, dissemination, amplification of meaning. Institutions like individuals grow, and cannot remain static. They must react and adapt to new data and perceptions. Yet, there is no self-regulating mechanism, ensuring smooth integration and reformulation. Possibly, the animating energizing values remain, even after the practices which they have inspired have changed, within the social sphere. All institutions in their social and historical contexts are subject to the dynamics of change, and must adapt efficaciously or outlive their usefulness. The role of institutions also involves transmission of ideas, as well as ongoing validation and reinforcement of basic values and perceptions of the prevailing social reality. And retention of coherent meaning requires a specific kind of built-in, self-evident, logical credibility. Berger and Luckman say the following. Reflective consciousness superimposes the quality of logic on the institutional order. The logic, thus attributed to the institutional order, is part of the available stock of knowledge and taken for granted as such. If the integration of an institutional order can be understood only in terms of the knowledge that its members have of it, it follows that the analysis of such knowledge will be essential for analysis of the institutional order in question. Theoretical knowledge is only a small part of what passes for knowledge in society. Theoretically sophisticated legitimations appear at particular moments of an institutional history. The primary knowledge about the institutional order is knowledge on a pre-theoretical level. It is the sum total of what everybody knows about a social world, an assemblage of maxims, morals, proverbial nuggets of wisdom, values and beliefs, myths and so forth. The internal quality of logic, implicit in the available stock of knowledge, both pre-theoretical and sophisticated, with which reflective consciousness projects, or superimposes on the institutional order, thus gives that order the appearance of a congruent and comprehensible self-subsistent logic of its own. And to understand the integration of the institution, and analysis of the institution in question, that knowledge, which is taken for granted as such, must be known only in the terms its members have of it, for it to be meaningful. That sum total of what everybody knows is the basic, pre-theoretical level, everyday compendium of common sense, primary knowledge, on the one hand. As well, there is a structure of theoretical sophisticated legitimations, at a higher level, which form the encompassing and ultimately definitive framework of validation for primary knowledge. These appear at certain moments of an institutional history, as the interplay of new and old ideas, ideals, values, insights, forms of speculation conspire to stimulate further consolidation, revision and reformulation of institutional substance and logic. In our continuing analysis, we focus mostly on the theoretical sophisticated legitimations of the major cultural institutions of knowledge, although the pre-theoretical contents of primary knowledge are also factored in as part of the ongoing dialectic in the representation of reality. More discussion of the relationship between the types of knowledge and their institutional configurations is needed before we can move to specific analysis of Western cultural history. We have now looked at two of the three terms in the phrase, authoritative legitimizing institutions. A word now on the use of the concept of authority in this cultural context. Technically, there are a number of interconnected ideational categories encompassing the spectrum of primary and sophisticated kinds of knowledge. Specific combinations and configurations coalesce to form what has been termed a worldview. On the macrocosmic scale, there are broad general worldviews which seem to encompass entire cultures, societies, civilizations in varying degrees of completeness. On the microcosmic level, each individual forms a personal worldview, partly implicit, partly explicit, based on assimilation of knowledge acquired privately and publicly. However, before we focus more specifically on the term worldview, we must refine our interpretations of the concept of knowledge itself. We have already applied a few specialized nuances in the usage of this term, but there are more precise conceptualizations found in the variety of theories pertaining to the study of the sociology of knowledge. We need not digress too much, but ought to supply a little more contextual substance before embarking upon an examination of the three significant legitimizing institutions of Western culture. Let us briefly look some of the categorizations found within the work of George Gervich, specifically in The Social Frameworks of Knowledge. Gervich differentiates 7 types of knowledge as social facts. 1. The perceptual knowledge of the external world postulates a coherent ensemble of images, placed in concrete and specific space and time. The ways in which they may be perceived and the possibilities of conceptualizing and quantifying them are very variable. The postulated, coherent ensemble of images, placed in concrete and specific space and time, which contribute to the perceptual knowledge of the external world, are the specifically envisioned representations of the most external component of experience. The wider environmental domain encompassing the personal and social entities. The very variable ways in which they may be perceived and the possibilities of conceptualizing and quantifying them indicate that in different cultural and social contexts, reality, as cosmos, can appear to be understood, presented and evaluated in a number of different ways. Even when individual perceptions may be discordant or incongruent with prevailing socially legitimated perspectives, there still are implicit criteria which will affect and define those views as well. He adds, an initial selection is made, as is appropriate for each perception, and dependent on frames of reference that tend to coincide with the social framework. For this reason, a considerable number of perceptions, even individual ones, are controlled and prompted by collective criteria. How could it be otherwise? Would not an individual perception isolated from collective criteria run the risk of becoming illusory? It is these frames of reference that tend to coincide with the social framework, where we shall find the collective criteria embedded within the cultural channels of legitimization. 2. Knowledge of the other, the we, groups, classes, and societies, perceived as real and verified by conscious judgment, represents a particular type of knowledge. By this type of knowledge, we move from the larger physical external environment to another dimension of objective reference, the other, the we, groups, classes and societies. Collectively, this may be called the social environment, with its various groupings. In our application of this category, we infer simply that in the multitude of societies, cultures, historical scenarios, different individuals, groups, institutions of power and authority will variously rise, endure, adapt, evolve, fade, in stature and esteem as socially viable interpreters of the nature of the real. And that in different contexts, the legitimation of being, perceived as real and verified by conscious judgment, variously invokes different feelings about, expectations from, degrees of respect towards, or credibility about, the specific social entity. Gervich notes, in the knowledge of the other, there is variation in the criteria, models, symbols suggested by different groups, classes and global societies for conceptualizing images of the other. Conceptualizing images of the other, for our purposes, involves applying those different status and value, criteria, models, symbols, to the individuals, groups, institutions most congruent with legitimizing functions. 3. Common sense knowledge. It consists of a combination of knowledge of the other and the we, of perceptual knowledge of the external world, certain simple forms of technical knowledge. It tends to favor traditional knowledge. Each generation, even each part of a generation, must work out its own common sense knowledge. Common sense knowledge is basically the subject matter of ordinary day-to-day consciousness. And as such, functions naturally within the ideational framework of a specific social construction of reality. Social and personal ideals, values, structures, relationships, repository of ideas about self and others are contained in the knowledge of the other and the we. The perceptual knowledge of the external world represents the most self-evident understanding of the immediate physical environment. Certain simple forms of technical knowledge include the basic functional skills and body of knowledge necessary for maintenance of current social and material status. Once established, the compendium of common sense knowledge tends to become entrenched, habitual, familiar. Sudden radical disruption is uncomfortable, because it tends to favor traditional knowledge, but change is part of the ongoing process, and each generation or part of a generation must work out its own common sense knowledge. The pace of change and subsequent revision of common sense knowledge has varied historically, though in recent times there has been an acceleration of the process. He further notes, but the success of this transmission of common sense knowledge is more problematical in modern industrial societies. The conditions of life there change at a baffling rate, imposed by continuous transformation of technique. We will look at some of the dynamics of modern culture later. What is important to stress right now is that common sense knowledge is less elite and technical, but a more widely prevalent, filtered down, repository of the types of worldviews and orientations to reality more explicitly articulated and defined by representative specialists in the particular types of knowledge. 4. Technical knowledge is a type of knowledge sui generis, irreducible to any other. It is that knowledge which is concerned with every kind of effective manipulation, artificial and subordinate, but tending to become independent and valued as such precise, transmissible, and innovative. Its acquisition is inspired by desire to dominate the worlds of nature, humanity, and society, in order to produce, destroy, safeguard, organize, plan, communicate and disseminate. Strictly speaking, this division of knowledge is more tangential to our main themes. In general, there have been a wide variety of diverse attempts to acquire specialized knowledge which is concerned with every kind of effective manipulation. These include the intent of utilizing allegedly as yet untapped capacities of the mind, as well the desire to dominate the worlds of nature, humanity, and society. The cliché that knowledge is power applies in many contexts, from the most selfish or ruthless to those with more universally beneficial and progressive objectives. It is the attitude towards acquiring and using specialized kinds of technical knowledge as much as the contents themselves which we shall explore where applicable. 5. Political knowledge consists of a particular network of spontaneous and reflective statements on the present, future, and sometimes past situation of a social structure or conjuncture. This knowledge is the most directly committed, i.e., it has first and foremost a partisan character. It is permeated not only by ideology, but also by utopias and myths. Once more, the category of political knowledge as such has only an indirect bearing on our subject. However, political considerations do factor into the discussion in a few ways. For one, the efficacy of a worldview as a pervasive social influence requires institutional embodiment of some form. Ideas, beliefs, values, the compendium of knowledge and so forth must be publicly represented, maintained, and made accessible, sustained at large within the social environment. Overt hostility instigated or encouraged from the political front affects credibility and operations. And explicit support allows wider dissemination and additional legitimacy in translating specialized knowledge to common sense knowledge. As well, ideational institutions are often proactive, energized with enthusiasm and conviction. This knowledge is the most directly committed, i.e., it has first and foremost a partisan character. And as well, no matter how intellectually sterile an ideational system, a worldview, an envisioning of reality may appear, very often the internal recapitulation of the history and evolution of the legitimizing institution attains a distinct narrative form. It is permeated not only by ideology, but also by utopias and myths. So even when literal political content may not be apparent, the parallels and models of political knowledge may yet be operative. 6. Scientific knowledge is a type of knowledge which tends towards disinterestedness, openness, accumulation, organization, a balance and conjunction of the conceptual and the empirical. It springs from what are essentially constructed, operative frameworks, which are justified by the results obtained, and themselves often require experimental verification. Since the advent of industrial society, it has entered into competition with philosophical knowledge, which, as a result, has had to give way to it. This knowledge is based on experience and experimentation, which are always essentially human and subject to human influence. All science is based on a conjunction between an operative conceptual framework of reference, experience and experimentation. Thus each new hypothesis, whether justified or not, bears the imprint of the structure of the society in which it was formulated. The scientific approach to knowledge represents a particular operation of the faculties of reason, a balance and conjunction of the conceptual and the empirical. The ideal attitude itself reflects a valuation of objectivity and attentiveness, as it tends towards disinterestedness, openness, accumulation, organization. And the methodology itself is always somewhat tentative, a conjunction between an operative conceptual framework of reference, experience and experimentation. Although guided and reoriented by adequacy in achieving pragmatic ends, justified by the results obtained. The mix of experience, conceptualization and experimentation reflects the application of reason in a strictly defined, operative framework, though there can never be an absolute purity of process because the subsequent knowledge is always essentially human and subject to human influence. And the entire supporting ideational framework, for each new hypothesis, will inevitably be conditioned by the variables of time and space, bearing the imprint of the society in which it was formulated. There is an inevitable degree of relativity and idiosyncratic representation rather than an absolute unconditioned pure objective static encapsulation of truth, as such. As well, important for our analysis, is the statement that, since the advent of industrial society, it has entered into competition with philosophical knowledge, which, as a result, has had to give way to it. As we shall show, the cultural institutions of philosophy and science are mutually related enterprises within the tradition of reason in Western culture, and have together helped shape the particular envisioned image of reality which has prevailed in various configurations over the centuries. 7. Philosophical knowledge is grafted retrospectively onto other kinds of knowledge, as onto non-cognitive mental acts, and it strives to integrate those partial aspects into infinite totalities, so as to validate them. In theory, this type of knowledge is exalted, remote, esoteric, and elitist. Although it issues from a dialectic between detached and committed knowledge, individual knowledge here predominates over collective knowledge. Philosophy is crystallized into sharply contrasting doctrines. Various schools are formed which are reminiscent of churches and are in perpetual conflict. The philosophical process is often intended as an act of synthesis, the application of the powers of reason to the data presented from other sources, grafted retrospectively onto other kinds of knowledge, as well as the introspective analysis of subjective experience, as onto non-cognitive mental acts. The attempt at synthesis, to integrate those partial aspects into infinite totalities, so as to validate them, becomes a matter of skill, vision, credibility. This type of knowledge is often presented as comprehensive, relegating other forms of knowledge to subsidiary roles within the envisioned schematic structure. Or, even when more an enterprise focused on specific topics, still tries to speak with a sense of encompassing authority, employing the assumed final authoritative set of intellectual criteria in analysis and judgment. Philosophical knowledge stands more removed from the environment of common sense knowledge. In theory, this type of knowledge is exalted, remote, esoteric, and elitist. The criteria for judging legitimacy, of being more or less adequate than competing options, the demonstration of internal self-consistency, etc., are formal and abstract. And yet, the dialectic between detached and committed knowledge shows that not mere theoretical technical manipulation of ideas is the objective of the enterprise. The impetus behind most philosophical systems is personal insight and vision, particularly coherent, consistent, comprehensive and precise ways of envisioning reality. Individual knowledge here predominates over collective knowledge. However, once articulated and disseminated in the social environment, divergent, contrasting and conflicting orientations may often coexist. Philosophy is crystallized into sharply contrasting doctrines, various schools are formed. And in the simultaneous competition for legitimacy, partisan ideological and ideational differences can provoke frictions and disputes, which are reminiscent of churches and are in perpetual conflict. Gurvich adds, philosophical knowledge occupied first place only in the ancient city, and in societies at the beginning of capitalism, where it was the basis for the Enlightenment. 2. As we have stated, this general outline refers to some of the substance in the conflict between legitimizing ideational structures as they evolved within Western civilization. The philosophical mode of envisioning and legitimizing reality is one of three dominant cultural components. As well as the 7 types of knowledge mentioned, Gurvich discerns 5 differently emphasized forms of knowledge within each specific type. He presents these 5 forms as dichotomies, showing tendencies or colorations of emphasis. These are located somewhere between the polar extremities of the dichotomies, depending on the specifics of each example. He say, since all knowledge is a dialectical combination of experiences and judgments, and since this combination itself can assume different characteristics, the forms of knowledge only rarely appear in a relatively pure form, they are more likely to appear as tendencies or colorations. His 5 dichotomies of the forms of knowledge are 1. Mystical knowledge and rational knowledge. 2. Empirical knowledge and conceptual knowledge. 3. Positive knowledge and speculative knowledge. 4. Symbolic knowledge and concrete knowledge. 5. Collective knowledge and individual knowledge. For our purposes, these dichotomies appear generally self-evident, need no further elaboration. They stand as interpretive categories for analysis and classification. However, one common theme underlying all knowledge ought to be emphasized. All knowledge presupposes both experience and conceptualization, although this is a matter of degree. The experience itself is primal, immediate, subjective. Its objective representation involves conceptualization through cultural and ideational forms. The matter of degree places each discrete type of knowledge somewhere in the spectrum between polar extremes, and by implication, more or less referable to subjective or objective criteria of evaluation. Some types of experience are more easily conceptualized, others less clearly defined by such treatments. And the dialectic between experience and representation underlies how reality is envisioned. With 7 distinctive types of knowledge, and 5 identifiable forms of knowledge, each with its own individual spectrum of tendencies and colorations, we have an intricate set of analytical tools. However, our intentions are not to simply dissect and classify every phenomenon or historical event as representative of one type or form or another. The inclusion of Gurvich's framework is more for recognizing the divisions of knowledge as they may appear culturally and historically. However, above and beyond that type of analysis is a more existential objective. Our intent is to try and discern how some of the substance of the different types and forms of knowledge coalesce and integrate into specific, worldviews, culturally specific envisioned representations of reality. Often it is a result of a combination of types and forms of knowledge, uniquely configured and legitimated, and collectively synthesized from a fusions of different tendencies and colorations from multiple sources. And the specific issue we are concerned with, how reality has been experienced, represented, legitimated in Western civilization, draws from all types and forms of knowledge. All of the categories enunciated factor into the final equation, but in varying degrees and in differing combinations. There is no straight linear historical route by which any type or form of knowledge can be seen in isolation, apart from the broader cultural and ideational mix. Specific orientations can be identified, and it is their envisioning spirit which we are attempting to follow. Historical process of Western legitimizing channels. Chapter 3. Now turning our attention to some of the cultural dynamics in Western civilization, it should be stressed that there is no intent of even a hint of any grandiose comprehensive schematic synthesis or pretense of any newly discovered Rosetta Stone with the key to hidden meanings. Our objective is far more modest. Very simply, merely to try and identify the primary legitimizing institutions of Western culture and trace the development of some of their key concepts. To try and look at how the notion of reality has been generally construed and represented within their prevailing ideational frameworks. And of course, recognizing all the while that in real-life social experience that most people form their worldviews from a mix of sources rather than purely express a single formal institutional or cultural representation. Much that shape views and ideas comes from the more prosaic sphere of everyday life, with the supporting foundation much more hidden, disguised or simplified beneath the surface. In addition, it should be stated that there have always been alternative worldviews and minority groups and individuals who deviate from the more consensus orientations. This has been especially true, but is much more prevalent in secular contexts. The 20th and 21st century have been filled with streams of diverse minority ways of envisioning reality, but regardless of deviations in orientation, all foundations are constructed from some materials having a religious, philosophical and/or scientific claim to authoritative status. The specificity of values and standards of truth are variable and finely nuanced, but retain their own credibility when accepted as a legitimate view of reality. For the present, we begin by focusing on the premise that there indeed is a distinctive, self-contained and identifiable categorical cultural entity loosely equated with, are characterized, by the most esteemed values or recurring attitudes expressed or implied in the term, Western civilization. Often defined and categorized according to the prevailing cultural or historical interest, there yet remains at least a somewhat common presumption that connecting links of shared ideals or ways of seeing and valuing things persist over time and can be discerned in a variety of contexts. These words in the preface of Harry Elmer Barnes' 3-volume, An Intellectual and Cultural History of the Western World, are representative. If one is familiar with the field, he realizes that the intellectual and cultural history of the Western world very naturally and logically organizes itself. This natural and logical organization is predicated on continuity and evolution of a number of distinctive traits and tendencies within the cultural matrix as a whole. We have used the terms faith and reason to very broadly signify both particular attitudes, ideals, values as well as types of referential content which appear to embody a distinctive Western cultural envisioning of reality. Let us try to generally characterize these terms before we move on to examine their legitimizing institutions. First, these words from Wilfred Cantwell Smith. Doctrinal formulations, theological systems, creeds, and the like in their historical profusion, variety, consequence and seriousness can be understood as statements by and for persons, and also, in a primary and immediate sense, about persons. Ultimately and indirectly they are statements about transcendence. Primarily and immediately they are about persons, whose faith means they are involved in such a transcendence. Faith lies in the hearts of men. Truth lies beyond faith, in the heart of God. Theologies, rites, music, dances, congregations, moralities, and much more, the materials of religious history, are in a significant part the expressions of faith of the persons who have produced or maintained them, so also are they, do they become, the ground of faith for those persons who come after. As a statement by and for about persons, the personal feelings, ideas, ideals pertaining to the experience of faith must be represented and culturally embedded. And this occurs through their conceptualization in historically conditioned, doctrinal formulations, theological systems, creeds and the like. As a private subjective experience, the primary and immediate feeling is that of transcendence. This deeply effective experience gives rise to a culturally maintained form of acknowledgement and commitment, expressed as faith, which ultimately denotes that those having arrived at a similar position are involved in such a transcendence. The act of faith is a personal existential statement, and lies in the hearts of men. Any kind of ontological verification is simply not obtainable, because the categories of knowledge pertaining to human sensibility cannot partake fully in the domain of the transcendent, which maintains a status of mystery and inscrutability. Truth lies beyond faith, in the heart of God. And we also see how this particular orientation of self to cosmos attains collective institutionalized signification within the materials of religious history, both as an active force, the expressions of faith of the persons who have produced or maintained them, as well as a perpetuating cultural paradigm for those persons who come after. And for a perspective on the nature of reason, the thoughts of George Santayana are instructive. Reason and humanity began with the union of instinct and ideation. When instinct becomes enlightened, establishes values in its objects, and is turned from a process into an art, while at the same time consciousness becomes practical and cognitive, beginning to contain some symbol or record of the coordinate realities among which it arises. Reason accordingly requires the fusion of two types of life. One a life of impulse expressed in affairs and social passions, the other a life of reflection expressed in religion, science, and the imitative arts. In the life of reason, if it were brought to perfection, intelligence would be at once the universal method of practice and its continual reward. The life of reason is the happy marriage of two elements, impulse and ideation, which if wholly divorced would reduce man to a brute or a maniac. The rational animal is generated by the union of these two monsters. He is constituted by ideas which have ceased to be visionary and actions which have ceased to be vain. Quote, we have earlier mentioned the processes by which experience becomes uniquely human, so discussion of the dichotomies of instinct and ideation, impulse, and reflection reiterates the duality inherent as part of those structural dynamics. What is important to discern is the emphasis placed on their synthesis and control. The union, turning process into art, reciprocal influences of becoming and establishing, fusion, happy marriage, all indicate that the sum is more significant than the parts. The ideal state of perfection is one in which an informed, wise and mature intelligence would be at once the universal method of practice and its continual reward. And conversely, fragmented or chaotic disjunction and divorce would reduce man to a brute or a maniac. Reason is an ideal of harmonious balance, governed by a firm, enlightened and practical intelligence, guided by ideas which have ceased to be visionary, in a purposeful, wise direction, actions which have ceased to be vain. These are only single snapshots of the concepts of faith and reason, which can easily be amplified and supplemented with any number of further interpretations, examples, perspectives. Though hardly exhaustive in any way, they yet serve to illustrate the basic directions each has followed in contributing to the envisioning of reality in Western culture. We shall try and look at these animating and energizing perspectives as they appear more formally expressed. Now, Having briefly touched upon the two major themes underlying the Western envisioning of reality, we return to the notion of an inclusive cultural domain. Without straying too far in the direction of strict systemization, let us, for our intended purposes, simply look at Western civilization as a self-contained cultural field. In that sense, the following words are instructive. They are from Pitirim Sorokin's work, Social and Cultural Dynamics. A cultural system has its own logic of function, change, and destiny, which is a result not only, and regularly not so much, of the external conditions, but of its own nature. It stresses that one of the most important determinators of the functioning and course of any system lies within the system itself, is inherent in it. In this sense, any inwardly integrated system is an autonomous, self-regulating, self-directing, equilibrated unity. Its life course is set down in its essentials when the system is born. This is one of the specific aspects of the large principle which may be called immanent self-regulation and self-direction. Although much is purely speculative inference and construction, the general tone and tenor of this kind of hypothetical interpretation does indeed suggest useful guidelines. What is relevant for our purposes is the indication that a cultural system has its own logic of function, change, and destiny. That a coherence and a continuity of discrete yet identifiable components within the cultural system can persist and evolve, interact yet retain essential characteristics and traits. Whether or not the functioning and course of any system is a matter of internal processes, coherently ordered and inwardly regulated, in an equilibrated unity, is irrelevant to our approach. We are not attempting to find a meaning within a meaning, simply observing and drawing conclusions. And even if its evolution proceeds through any number of phases, always according to an original immanent directive, that is outside our scope of exploration. Presuming that its life course is set down in its essentials when the system is born, will lead to interpretation of data to support that premise. And if this is only one of potentially more specific aspects of the large principle which may be called immanent self-regulation and self-direction, then we shall have to abandon our limited intentions and incorporate a broader set of criteria to deal with more theoretical issues. In the meantime, incorporating the hypothesis about a self-consistent self-contained logic of function, change, destiny for cultural systems will permit an additional viable set of criteria for inquiry. As well, implied within the notion of a comprehensive cultural system is the acknowledgement that it reflects a particular orientation to the world, to experience, to reality. Most commonly, that aspect of the cultural mix is generically referred to as worldview. It may be seen as the inclusive summation of particular interpretations of data from a number of interconnected cultural channels. As an orientation based on selected portions of the cumulative record, drawn from specific fields of knowledge and other diverse sources. And of course there are a plurality of worldviews at any time in a society, though particular more authoritative and legitimizing ideational structures do dominant within cultures. If we look at these thoughts from Dilthey, we can broaden our frame of reference. Worldviews develop under different conditions, climate, races, nationalities, determined by history and through political organizations, the time-bound confines of epochs and eras. All of them combine into the special conditions which mark from the outset a multiple growth of worldviews. Those worldviews which promote a deeper understanding of life and lead on to more useful goals of life are conserved and eliminate the minor ones. A selection takes place among the competitors. And in the course of generations the viable ones evolve into more perfect structures. There is a permanent renewal of combinations of life experience, sentiments and ideas in a given worldview prevailing in a certain period of history and in its context. When we subject these structures to a comparative treatment, we discover that they coalesce into groups among which there exists a certain affinity. The universality, variety, variability of encompassing worldviews is apparent, as they develop under different conditions, climate, races, nationalities, determined by history and through political organizations, the time-bound confine of epochs and eras. Each specific configuration is somewhat unique to some degree because of the variables of their environment and the special conditions of their genesis. A worldview is legitimizing, provides a context of definition and interpretation of experience, and supplies an ongoing meaning and purpose, a deeper understanding of life and led on to more useful goals of life. Within the larger social sphere, the plurality of options eventually narrows down to a choice, a selection takes place among the competitors. And in time, over the course of generations, as a result of the effects of ongoing social, institutional, ideational dynamics, the most adequately functional or comfortable fit takes hold. And if remaining relatively intact and unchallenged, will proceed to logically develop. The viable ones evolve into more perfect structures. The given worldview embodies the combinations of life experience, sentiments and ideas, and, while dominant and efficacious, is somewhat flexible and malleable, allowing for a permanent renewal of combinations. However, as such it is still limited and ultimately vulnerable to radical change or discarded as no longer relevant. It is vital, energizing, attuned to majority values, beliefs and ideals only while prevailing in a certain period of history and in its context. Future or other worldviews of course may integrate portions of another, and in fact maintain certain traditional lines of envisioning, but they will still be different. Our continuing analysis will not focus on the entirety of any worldview as such, but try and differentiate a few of the important elements which have persisted over time in shaping the way reality has been envisioned in Western civilization. Having referred to an inclusive, cultural system, it may appear simplistic and selective to pull out just three broad institutions of legitimization from the encompassing multifaceted framework. For our purposes though, we are not looking at each and every cultural channel. We are concerned with those explicitly intended to represent reality, to provide definitive and legitimizing frameworks for interpreting the nature of the real. However, we feel that taken over the extended period of time to be discussed, there indeed are clear historical tendencies which can be delineated. Particular configurations of types and forms of knowledge contributing to identifiable traditions and perspectives. As well, we should emphasize before discussing detail that all three legitimating institutions have existed simultaneously in various stages of development and maturation, each progressing through its own internal alignments and developments. As well, it need be stressed that in real life, most individuals personally synthesize consciously and unconsciously elements from various sources of legitimation to arrive at their own private state of comfort and depth of understanding about the nature of reality. While at large encompassing ideational structures provide sophisticated knowledge, each individual draws from a mix of that knowledge and their own slice of primary knowledge. So when we talk of the legitimizing authority changing over time, it really indicates a change in emphasis, respect, esteem, social stature as well as shifts in content and focus. Not that the other orientations are non-existent or do not have important influence for many in terms of shaping their visions of reality, or that there are not peaks and valleys in credibility and popularity. In fact, at times, as one prevalent form of representation begins to emerge as a generally important framework of treating and evaluating experience, another will already be in place functioning adequately for the majority of the culture. As mentioned in the process of internalization, there is a dimension of ongoing reconstruction and revaluation which pervades and flows persistently, sometimes as an undercurrent, sometimes more visibly. And we will show that over time, this process of culturally envisioning a particular type of reality, representing the ideas and ideals of the traditions of faith and reason, has been prominently enabled and supported via three major legitimizing channels in Western history. Sorokin, in his analysis of culture, differentiates a specific compartment, which he terms the system of truth and knowledge. This system, in integrated or unintegrated form, is embodied in what is loosely styled religious, philosophical and scientific thought of a given culture. These categories can be roughly equated with our differentiation of the three major institutions of legitimization for representations of reality. Sorokin extends his analysis through an elaborate schematic representation of all facets of culture, cross-referencing and isolating elements from within to support his views. As well, his classifications can also be seen to incorporate and combine differently emphasized mixes of some of the types and forms of knowledge enunciated in Gerbich's analysis. Each presents a framework for interpretation and classification focused on specific objectives and supporting particular premises. For our purposes, they are mutually useful, reciprocally beneficial in helping to understand the way reality has been represented and legitimated in Western civilization. Comparisons of each approach, examination of points of confirmation or divergence would lead us to digress unnecessarily. As we continue our narrative, references will be made where appropriate. Right now, a brief examination of Sorokin's characterizations of the three components of the cultural truth systems will be useful. In his classification, the truth of faith corresponds in essence with the substance of religious thought. Its subject matter is seen in this way. Mainly the supersensory and superational subjects, and realities. God, devil, angels, spirits, soul, immortality, salvation, sin, redemption, resurrection, paradise, purgatory, inferno, and so on, with an enormous number of other subproblems of the same kind. The sensory and empirical phenomena are studied only incidentally, and even then, not for their own sake but merely visible signs of the invisible world, as symbols of the supersensory reality. The supreme discipline in such a system of truth is always theology as a science of the supersensory realities. The exposition of the truth isopodictic and symbolic. And the method of validation, or, from our perspective, legitimation, is based upon this process. Mainly reference to the sacred source, to the scripture revealed, in the form of quotations from it which would show that the statement perfectly agrees with the scripture. If a new truth is claimed, the method of demonstration is to show that it is due to the same divine inspiration to which the scripture is due. Purely logical reasoning and the testimony of the organs of senses have only a subsidiary role. And only so far as they do not contradict the truth of the revealed scripture. Otherwise they are unhesitatingly rejected as invalid or even inspired by the devil, heresy, blasphemy, black magic, etc. In his classification, the truth of reason corresponds basically to the parameters of philosophical thought. As such, this is how it is described. Partly supersensory, partly sensory empirical. Each for its own sake, but the value of the knowledge about the sensory phenomena is subordinated to that of the supersensory realities. The total system of knowledge here incorporates usually in the form of idealistically rationalistic philosophy, reasoning and empirical knowledge in the sense of the contemporary science. The ultimate reality is thought of as knowable. The exposition of the truth is dialectic and deductive. And the method of validation requires this approach. Intermediary between the methods of the other two systems. Mainly the method of logical reasoning, but also reference to the testimony of the organs of senses. Both these methods are always covered and given an ultimate support by the proper references to the scripture and revealed truth. Hence concretely in the works which embody this system of truth one always finds the dialectical method, reference to the organs of the senses and their data, and quotations from the scripture or a source equivalent to it. All these references to the three sources of truth tend to show that their testimony is unanimous and that they do not contradict each other. It is the method in which the evidence of scripture, of logic, and of the senses is perfectly harmonious. In the truth of sense, we see correspondence with the materials of scientific thought. This is how it is characterized. Mainly the world of the sensory perception, like the phenomena studied in the natural sciences. When the phenomena seem to have an aspect not easily reducible to the sensory material forms, science concentrates mainly at their sensory aspect and either disregards the non-material aspect or treats it as subsidiary and tries to measure them through the measurement of the sensory external phenomenal forms. Hence the tendency to objectivism, behaviorism, quantativism, mechanisticism. The supersensory realities are declared either non-existent, or irrelevant or unknowable, criticism, agnosticism, positivism. The natural sciences become the leaders as the most perfect, exact sciences, and are copied. Exposition of the truth is inductive and especially experimental. And the method of the validation of this type of truth is in this manner. As he puts it, mainly the reference to the testimony of the organs of senses often reinforced by their extensions, telescopes, microscopes, etc., supplanted by the logical reasoning, especially in the form of the mathematical reasoning. But even the well-reasoned theory remains in the stage of pure hypothesis, unproved till it is tested by the sensory facts, and it is unhesitatingly rejected if these facts contradict it. The truth of faith and its scriptures do not play any role in the system and are not regarded as evidence. If anything, they most often are regarded as mere superstitions. In the case where some pious or hypocritical reference to the scripture is given, often merely for practical reasons, it usually does not play any important part and is mostly superfluous. The truth of faith has as little value by itself in this system of truth as the testimony of senses in the system of truth of faith. Rather than an extensive explication of each stated detail for each of the systems of truth and their validations, let us now simply make a few general observations. Firstly, the classification obviously is phrased in such terms to clearly indicate a reference to Western civilization, although a wider application is possible with use of more expansive analogies. As well, terms like scripture and revealed truth have obvious historical connotations, though, again, may be conceived in a broader sense. Especially when used in discussing truth of reason and truth of sense. For instance, when mentioning the validation of reason, one of the characteristics is use of quotations from the scripture or a source equivalent to it. In some historical contexts, the literal reference is accurate. However, in others, more emphasis should be put on the source equivalent to it interpretation. For instance, in many philosophical and scientific schools of thought, particular bodies of knowledge, texts, teachings, and so forth serve as similar authoritative criteria. While not imbued with the same purported transcendental validation, they yet provide the same sort of evaluative functionality. What falls outside their parameters often immediately acquires the label of falsehood, error, mistake, misconception, because of nonconformity to the prevailing representation of the revealed truth. Another useful interpretive framework comes from E.A. Burt in his book, In Search of Philosophic Understanding. He begins by recognizing that the common sense world of everyday experience is a conditioned and relative representation of reality, and that common sense knowledge is inadequate in providing more comprehensive understanding of the larger universe. Its ideas are vague, loose-jointed, and ambiguous, even contradictory. Also, they are often found not to square with the realities they claim to describe. Moreover, there is another defect. Common sense lacks a universal perspective. Its world is always the world of a limited society with its limited cultural heritage. Burt recognizes that three ways of correcting common sense have historically evolved in Western civilization. Thus far, Western thought has hit upon three methods in the quest for a trustworthy way of correcting common sense. They have appeared in a definite order. Surveying them in that order, we may call them the ways of intuitionalism, rationalism, and empiricism. These three methods fairly accurately correspond to Sorokin's systems of truth and support our division of legitimating institutions, as we shall see. Looking at Burt's classifications, he sees intuitionalism as the first of a unique way of correcting common sense. Taking intuitionism then as a distinctive way of revising common sense beliefs, let us imagine ourselves in the age of the Hebrew prophets and the early Greek poets and tragedians who vividly illustrate it. During the same age, farmers and artisans were slowly accumulating scraps of what now would be called technical lore. The intellectual elite, the shamans, seers, and prophets, did notice something else: the crucial and mysterious moment when a new idea, conveying a persuasive answer to some urgent perplexity, is born. Interpreted by the religious concepts which as yet were the only ones available for the purpose, these intuitions were naturally taken as revelations of the divine, oracles, inspired seizures, each carrying its voucher of authenticity on its face. Knowledge, thus interpreted, is an aggregate of such intuitions, bound together by no rational order. Any two of them might contradict each other. The criterion for determining their truth was in effect just the potent compellingness of each idea as it came. Historical oversimplification aside, this isolation of a distinctive way of revising common sense beliefs illustrates some important points. For one, that articulation and cultural institutionalization was instigated by the intellectual elite. When the persuasive answer to some urgent perplexity was intuited at the crucial and mysterious moment, the new idea took on the representational form of the prevailing ideational legitimating institution. Interpreted by the religious concepts which as yet were the only ones available for the purpose. As a non-rational kind of experience, these intuitions were naturally taken as revelations of the divine. And the referential context of legitimacy was implicit, with each carrying its voucher of authenticity on its face. This kind of knowledge, thus interpreted, is an aggregate of such intuitions. Thus, as a distinctive way of enhancing the common sense interpretation of reality, the knowledge derived from the intuitional mode of experience is bound together by no rational order. Credibility and authenticity does not depend on rational or intellectual standards, but the criterion for determining their truth was in effect just potent compellingness of each idea as it came. What is inferred by compellingness and intuitional knowledge pertains to the domain of religion for derivation of explicit meaning. In Burt's narrative, the intuitional method of augmenting common sense knowledge was incapable of providing a logically connected and rationally grounded non-contradictory synthesis, he says. It was this lack of coherence that proved in the long run intolerable. Intuitions did conflict with each other, and yet the method of intuition supplied no principle by which to resolve the conflicts. However, as history unfolded and other configurations of articulated experience emerged and matured, intuitionalism was joined by rationalism as a distinct means of envisioning. And it was one key factor which enabled this other approach to effectively work. Burt continues. The discovery of mathematics, and reflection on its method, was the main factor in opening a new page and marvelous vista. A second essential phase of knowledge-getting became the focus of attention, the process of deductive inference, with the systematic consistency of thought which is made possible. This second essential phase of knowledge-getting was concurrently evolving, but not yet a component in the primary legitimating methodology. Only when it became the focus of attention could this new page and marvelous vista begin to open. After its discovery, and reflection on its method, the conceptual tools of mathematics could be applied and the systematic consistency of thought be sought after. Explained as following by Burt. In its own field, mathematics brought these scattered intuitions into logical connection with each other. Certain groups of them were seen to be so bound together that when some of them were accepted, they inflexibly dictated acceptance or rejection of others. Intuitions are now adopted and articulated in such a way that their meaning is the same to every tutored mind and their implications are systematically traceable. Moreover, mathematical axioms revealed another magnificent virtue. They had the power to anticipate dependably a wider range of factual experience than any other intuitions that had captivated men's minds. All quantitative relations that might be found in it were brought under intelligent mastery. The application of mathematical reasoning discerned logical connection between the scattered intuitions, creating a systematic compendium of knowledge based on abstract axioms of truth. And shared confirmation and understanding was possible for those who could apply the principles of logical reasoning. Their meaning is the same to every tutored mind and their implications systematically traceable. And the adequacy and credibility of any assumption could be tested publicly. By being able to anticipate dependably a wider range of factual experience, and bring intelligent mastery to all quantitative relations, a foundation of rational knowledge-getting was established as noted here. The ideal of knowledge, as coherently organizable and demonstratively certain, came to dominate Western thought, especially when the basic lesson of mathematics was confirmed by the logical syllogism of Aristotle. This formal pattern revealed the way in which the mind must proceed from any subject-predicate premises to a conclusion if the inference is to be valid. We may best refer to this revolutionary orientation by the word rationalism. Knowledge was now viewed as a system of truths bound together by strands of logic. No longer to be taken or left on the authority of a seer or the compulsion of some vivid idea. Every piece of it was capable of demonstration. One could trace its necessary relations to a set of ultimate principles, which, when clearly grasped, appeared self-evidently true. A clearly distinctive approach to envisioning reality exists between intuitionalism and rationalism. The legitimizing apparatus shifts from the authority of a seer or the compulsion of some vivid idea, to a system of truths bound together by strands of logic. The preeminence of the rational form of knowledge extended from the practical domain to the speculative sphere. Being able to trace its necessary relations to a set of ultimate principles, allowed for purely rational analytical criteria. And the cognizance that by exercise of reason truth could be clearly grasped, and appear self-evidently true, allowed for pure philosophical speculation. However, historically, in the social world, there are rarely occasions when only one type of knowledge or mode of experience exclusively dominates. In fact, even as rationalism was acquiring more credibility, intuitionalism yet retained status as an entrenched way of envisioning reality, prioritizing experience somewhat differently and extrapolating other sets of signification and implication. He says, so far as concerns the status of those principles, the viewpoint of intuitionalism remained in control, and what seemed still valid in its presuppositions was thus preserved. Their character as intuitions was obvious, yet they were intuitions of a special kind. A wide range of other important truths was inferable from them. They were thus rational insights on which a vast structure of knowledge could be firmly built. Thus, a certain amount of cross-fertilization and revision existed between reason and intuitions of a special kind, rational insights. Where empathy and connectivity could be found, importantly, as noted, a vast structure of knowledge could be firmly built. However, much of the substance of intuitionism was simply intrinsically incompatible with the treatments of reason, deriving from a different modality of experience. Mere, inspired visions, unable to find a place in such a logical order, were no longer quite respectable, save in such fields as religion and art, where rationalism was long impotent to gain a sure foothold. Yet even there the intuitionism of the earlier vintage, at least, was forced into a losing struggle. The way of systematic demonstration, once successful everywhere, seemed clearly the way that ought to be successful everywhere. Reason, in its power to apprehend deductive form and self-evident axioms, is a single faculty, and once it has found itself it claims universal authority. The presence of other, mere, intuitionist phenomena, unable to find a place in the logical order, declined as major components of the rationally grounded legitimating channels. Any truth quotient falls to the fields of religion and art, and recedes from the forefront of rationalist values. As the progressively dominant mode envisioning the way of systematic demonstration, successful everywhere, seems clearly the way that ought to be successful everywhere. The ideas, ideals, and the values of the rationalistic approach become the authoritative criteria and are used to judge and evaluate all facets of life. And reason, in its power to apprehend deductive form and self-evident axioms, is a single faculty. Thus established as a technique for envisioning, it becomes a defining component of the legitimation process. So that, once it has found itself it claims universal authority. Burt continues. This was at least the confident assumption of the philosophers, who soon appeared on the scene. Their task was to extend the rationalistic method to all subjects and to show no range of human experience lay beyond the power of logical demonstration to master it. In this, under the lead of Plato and Aristotle, Descartes and Spinoza, Kant and Hegel, they were surprisingly successful, thus weaving a comprehensive system in which God, morality, political organization, and art were all assigned their places, was the rationalist par excellence. This orientation won its victory. Propositions incapable of domestication in the system of truths established by its methods no longer seemed to exemplify the proper ideal of knowledge. They were stray ideas, expressing some individual's or group's opinion. They might be true, but their truth has not been proved. The rationalistic approach became institutionalized in the enterprise of philosophy, represented at first by the philosophers, who soon appeared on the scene. The ideal of an inclusive, comprehensive envisioning of reality by the rationalist method meant that no range of human experience lay beyond the power of logical demonstration to master it. All dimensions of experience, all kinds of knowledge, all subjects, were the materials of particular conceptual and analytical treatments. And from each perspective, all significant categories of experience and knowledge were assigned their place, when woven into the specific, comprehensive system, promoted by the specific philosopher or school of thought. As a legitimizing institution, philosophy emerged with a significant degree of authority, primarily amongst the intellectual elite. This orientation won its victory. A proliferation of other perspectives may exist, but if they were incapable of domestication in the system of truths, which retained primary legitimizing status, they were accorded secondary significance. Despite the rise of philosophy as an authoritative institution of legitimization, in continual contact or conflict with the institution of religion, both the intuitional and the rationalistic orientations were constrained in their modes of envisioning. And the philosophical application of reason itself was reconfigured to allow for a different prioritization. Reiterating his point, Burt adds, just as those intuitions could not be compared from any common base, so in the case of conflict a reasonable decision might be made. In the same way the tidy systems of the rationalist, when used to explain the observable fact of nature, sometimes led to diverse explanations, between which only an arbitrary choice could be made. Thinkers gradually learned that the only reliable way to settle such conflicts between two or more explanations, equally justified by their axiomatic foundation and their rigorous logic, was to concentrate on the observable facts, not casually, but with persistent patience, so as to devise a method capable of coping with their distinctive challenge. The application of reason in the purely rationalistic way could produce self-consistent and systematically encompassing representations of reality, but even with those tidy systems, and their axiomatic foundation and rigorous logic, occasions presented themselves when the observable facts of nature defied a single certain explanation. And again, a concurrent though historically more peripheral approach to envisioning reality rose to prominence as most adequate and applicable. This was the empirical approach, which was to concentrate on the observable facts, not casually, but with persistent patience, so as to devise a method capable of coping with their distinctive challenge. He continues. How was this new orientation achieved? Investigators turned to systematic observation and experiment as the ultimate court of appeal, guided by canons that were laboriously clarified through a process of trial and error, while retaining the rationalist method so far as it was still pertinent. The outcome was a sound procedure for choosing between different explanations of any sets of facts, the most reliable procedure available at any given time and capable of indefinite improvement as its results are noted and the lessons they teach are learned. The movement is one of orientation, based on a different set of criteria, with systematic observation and experiment as the ultimate court of appeal. The empirical, or scientific, institution gradually acquired the defining characteristics which set it apart as a separate framework of legitimation. Through a process trial and error, new parameters were established so guidance and evaluation could be determined by reference to those canons that were laboriously clarified over time. The cumulative result was an improved methodology, a sound procedure for choosing between different explanations of any sets of facts. The supporting rationalist logical framework was employed where seemingly needed, as it was retained, so far as it was pertinent. However, the new orientation presupposed an ideal of continued refinement to account for any new knowledge. At any given moment, the most reliable procedure available would suffice, but it also implied a degree of built-in adaptability, the capability of indefinite improvement, as new results are noted and the lessons they teach are learned. Continuing his line of thought, Burt adds, intuitions, even the axiomatic principles, were now demoted from the status they had retained under rationalism. Their pretensions to self-evidence could no longer be allowed. Those testable by observation are but hypotheses, are candidates for knowledge, whose right to this title depends on their power to gain verification. The forms of deductive inference, on their bearing on the acquisition of knowledge, were also reinterpreted. No longer demonstrations of truth to be accepted solely on the warrant of their logical validity, they became a network of reliable highways by which thought could pass from a conceived hypothesis to propositions that must be true if it is true but are subject to general observation as a proposition is not. The time when knowledge could consist of axiomatic principles, together with the conclusions reached by rational demonstration from them, is past. It is now the sum total, at any given time, of verifiable hypotheses whose claim to truth is relative rather than absolute, since new facts of observation may at any time compel their revision. Knowledge thus becomes a living and growing affair, in the sense that the premises themselves are always being improved through man's progress in mastering the infinitely complex world disclosed by sense perception. The success of the way of empiricism has likewise proved definitive. Once established, its drastic reconstruction of the principles of rationalism has been retained. A system of propositions unable to square itself with the relevant observable facts is no longer quite respectable. The transition in status of legitimating institutions resulted in rationalism, as expressed in philosophical systemization, to recede as the most esteemed method of envisioning reality. The scope and focus of philosophical inquiry was compelled to change as science, or the way of empiricism, grew in stature and credibility. With premises always being improved, Because new facts of observation may at any time compel their revision, the prioritization of the new methodology introduced a revised set of criteria and ideals. The valuation of the ideals of reason was not totally discarded, but a different orientation evolved founded upon that drastic reconstruction of the principles of rationalism. So, tracing the various ways of envisioning reality, we see that each has its own unique configuration and institutional embodiment. In Western history, there have been shifts of stature and importance for each, although they have existed simultaneously in varying degrees of maturation and influence. And man has thus had a variety of orientations by which to envision reality. In the era of intuitionism, his world was what custom and habit had traditionally taken for granted, modified slowly by novel ideas that appealed to this or that keen mind and were gradually accepted by others. In the era of rationalistic confidence, his world was a system of principles generally regarded as self-evident along with inferences about the cosmos that could logically be drawn from them. Now in the era of empiricism, his world is the manifold of facts of observation, organized in more or less comprehensive theories and continually expanding through new discoveries. It is in that world that you and I live today, and it is slowly becoming accepted by all living men. Burt's narrative is instructive more for its identification of distinctive types of knowledge by which common sense could be corrected, than for the presumption of a straightforward linear march of progress. The historical differentiation of the era of intuitionism, the era of rationalism, the era of empiricism, do generally indicate the conditions in which the distinctively envisioned representations of reality were constructed. Rather than quibble with the details of that outline, we shall keep it as a reference for our own analysis. And it need be stressed that analytical classifications are never absolutely precise for each and every occasion. Sorokin's division of the three systems of truth within a culture is a useful and generally accurate way of organizing historical data, but not the only way. And Burt's enunciation of intuitional, rationalistic, and empirical types of knowledge and corresponding eras likewise is a useful speculative outline. As is Gervich's classification of the 7 types and 5 forms of knowledge. Cross-referencing and comparing schematics and categories as an end unto itself would be an interesting exercise, but a digression. We shall consider them as sets of conceptual tools, kept on hand for possible application if or when deemed necessary during our own excursion.